Fort Carver Army Air Base had some of the most decorated Apache pilots in the country, and every single one of them had been in the cockpit that week except her. Captain Maya Brooks had the highest simulator scores on the base, the fastest reaction times in the unit, and 14 months of being quietly, deliberately kept on the ground. She had stopped expecting explanations. What she hadn't stopped doing, not once, was showing up. And when a legendary Admiral arrived and one routine flight put her in the sky at exactly the right moment, everything was about to change. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The desert heat was already building by 6 in the morning. Out on the tarmac at Fort Carver Army Air Base, the sun climbed fast over the mountain ridgeline to the east, painting the flight line in long orange shadows. The AH-64 Apache helicopters sat in 2 neat rows, their rotors still, their hulls dark and angular against the pale sky. Ground crews moved between the aircraft with fuel lines and tool kits, their boots scraping on the hot pavement, their voices low against the hum of maintenance equipment running in the hangar behind them. It was a morning like dozens of others at Fort Carver. To someone passing through, it would have looked orderly, purposeful, routine. But for Captain Maya Brooks, standing near the edge of the flight line with her helmet bag at her feet and her hands resting at her sides, there was nothing routine about it all. She had been watching the roster board for the last 10 minutes. Her name wasn't on it. Again, she let the silence settle over her for a moment, the way she always did when something hit harder than she wanted to let on. She breathed in, breathed out, and looked at the board again as if the second look might change something. It didn't. 14 pilot names were listed for the day's training mission. 14 assignments across 7 aircraft. She had shown up in full gear, she had completed her pre-mission checklist, she had done everything right, and her name simply wasn't there. This was the 3rd week in a row. Around her, the other pilots were gathering in loose clusters, talking through their assignments, making the easy jokes that people make when they're already comfortable with their place in the lineup. Lieutenant Aaron Cole, a young officer with a lean face and sharp eyes, caught her gaze from across the tarmac and held it for just a second before he looked away. He had the kind of expression that said he noticed but didn't know what to do about it. Maya had been seeing that expression on people for months. She picked up her helmet bag and walked toward the hangar. There was no use standing in the open air waiting to be seen. If she waited, she would end up watching again instead of flying. And she was very tired of watching. The morning briefing took place in the operations room, just off the main hangar, a long, low-ceilinged space with folding chairs arranged in front of a projection screen and a whiteboard covered in mission parameters. The room smelled like burnt coffee and dry erase marker. Colonel Victor Hayes stood at the front with his reading glasses pushed down his nose and a printed briefing sheet held loosely at his side. Hayes was not a big man, but he had a way of occupying space that made him feel larger than he was. He had been base commander at Fort Carver for 2 years and had come up through the Army the old way, slowly, carefully, never risking anything he wasn't certain he would win. He had a polished service record and an easy authority in front of room, and he used both of them like furniture. The pilots respected him. Most of them. He went through the day's assignments with the measured pace of a man who had given this briefing many times. Team 1 would run the canyon approach sim. Team 2 was assigned low-altitude grid navigation. Team 3 would cover the urban terrain exercise. He read names with the same flat, official tone for each one. Maya's name never came. She sat in the 3rd row and kept her face still. There was no administrative error. She had checked her status twice that morning, and she was fully certified, fully current, and fully available. She was, in fact, the most qualified co-pilot on the base for the day's primary mission profile. Everyone in the room knew that, too. It wasn't a secret. It was something closer to a shared silence, the kind that happens when a group of people all agree, without ever saying so, to pretend that something obvious isn't happening. Hayes finished reading, looked up, and asked if there were questions. No one said anything. The pilots began gathering their gear, talking among themselves, moving toward the door. Maya stood, tucked her notepad under her arm, and walked out with them. Aaron Cole caught up with her near the exit door. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low even though the nearby pilots were already moving away. "You saw the roster." "I saw it," Maya said. "That's the third time this month." He fell in a step beside her as they moved down the corridor toward the flight equipment room. "I don't understand it. Your sim scores are the highest in the unit. Your flight hours in the Apache are." "I know what my scores are," she said quietly. Cole was quiet for a moment. He was 27, younger than Maya by 5 years, and he had come up through flight school with the kind of natural talent that made instructors take notice. He had arrived at Fort Carver 8 months ago, fresh from a deployment rotation, and it had taken him about 3 weeks to realize that something was off about the way the unit treated Captain Brooks. "It's not just Hayes," he said finally. "Shaw's been talking to people." Maya kept walking. "I know that too. He told Captain Decker that you freeze under pressure. I heard it secondhand." Cole shook his head. "It's not right." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She stopped at the door to the equipment room and looked at him directly. "But talking about what isn't right doesn't change the roster, does it?" He didn't have an answer for that. She went inside. Commander Derek Shaw was the kind of pilot who made sure you knew he was a pilot. He wore his reputation like a second uniform. The 2 combat deployments, the commendation for the low-altitude extraction in Kandahar, the stories that had a way of circulating without ever quite seeming like bragging. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and comfortable in rooms the way people are when they've spent their entire careers being the one everyone looks at. He had been Fort Carver's unofficial Top Gun for the better part of 18 months, and he had made peace with that long ago. Maya Brooks had arrived at the base 14 months earlier, and something about her presence had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't entirely explain and certainly wouldn't admit. Her simulator numbers were better than his. Her technical knowledge of the Apache systems was better than most of the crew chiefs. She was quiet in a way that bothered him. Not deferential quiet, but self-contained quiet, the kind that doesn't need anything from the room it's in. He had started small. A comment here, a skeptical eyebrow there. By the time the pattern was established, it had become part of the background noise at Fort Carver. Maya Brooks was good on paper, but Derek Shaw was the real thing. Most people accepted this the way they accepted a lot of things, without looking too closely at the evidence. That morning, after the briefing, he stood near the locker room with Captain Nate Fulton, one of the other senior pilots, and kept his voice just loud enough to carry. "You want to know the thing about simulator scores?" he said, pulling his flight gloves on one finger at a time. "They don't account for instinct. They don't account for the split-second decision that keeps an aircraft in the air when everything goes wrong." He glanced toward the corridor Maya had walked through. "Some people can train for mechanics. Elite combat missions need a different level. That's just reality." Fulton nodded along in the vague way of someone who mostly agreed and didn't want a conversation about it. Shaw finished with his gloves and walked toward the flight line. He didn't say Maya's name. He didn't need to. The morning passed without Maya leaving the ground. Around 11 o'clock, she found Sergeant Luis Ortega in the third bay of the main hangar, crouched beneath the nose of an Apache with a diagnostic tablet in his hand and a look of steady concentration on his face. Ortega was 41 years old and had been maintaining AH-64s since he was 22. He was compact and unhurried in the way that really skilled people often are. Everything he did looked like it had been done 1,000 times before, because most of it had. 3 other mechanics had been circling the same helicopter for most of the morning, troubleshooting a fault in its targeting sensor array that had been throwing intermittent error codes. They had checked the cable harnesses, replaced a junction module, run 3 diagnostic cycles, and still hadn't located the source. Maya crouched beside Ortega and looked at the tablet screen. "FLIR integration fault," she said. "But the FLIR itself is clean." "That's what I keep coming back to," Ortega said. Maya was quiet for a moment, studying the pattern of the error codes. Did anyone pull the multiplexer board in the secondary targeting bus? If the board is seated right, but the contact pins have surface oxidation, it'll throw this exact code without showing a clear hardware fault. Ortega looked at her. Then he reached into the access panel and pulled the board. He turned it toward the light. The contact pins along the left edge had the pale gray tint of mild oxidation, barely visible without good lighting. He looked back at her. 3 mechanics, he said. 2 hours. It's an easy thing to overlook, she said. She wasn't being generous about it. She was just being accurate. Ortega cleaned the pins, reseated the board, and ran the diagnostic cycle again. The fault code was gone. He sat back on his heels and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "I'll tell you something," he said, keeping his voice low enough that it didn't carry beyond the immediate space. "Every mechanic on this flight line knows exactly what kind of pilot you are. The people who work on these aircraft, we see the data. We see the post-flight reports. We see the numbers." He set his tablet down on the floor beside him. "But the way this command structure works, the people who know the most aren't always the ones who get to say anything." Maya nodded slowly. "I know. It's not right." "No," she said. "It isn't." She handed him back his torque wrench and stood up. Ortega watched her walk toward the far end of the hangar and shook his head quietly before turning back to his work. By early evening, the day's training flights had wrapped up, and the officers' lounge was filling with the low, comfortable noise of a post-flight crowd. Flight suits unzipped to the waist, boots on the floor, the television in the corner showing a news channel that no one was really watching. The atmosphere was relaxed in the way it always got after a day of good flying, slightly loose, slightly self-congratulatory. The topic that found its way to the surface, as it had been doing for the last several days, was the incoming visit. An admiral was coming. Admiral Robert Kincaid, to be specific, a name that carried real weight in military aviation circles. He had flown combat missions in 2 different decades, had commanded naval aviation units in multiple theaters, and had a reputation among pilots as someone who could watch a single flight approach and landing and tell you more about the pilot than the pilot's own evaluation sheet. He was known for cutting through whatever presentation a base command had assembled for him and going straight to the actual operational picture. Commanders did not enjoy visits from Admiral Kincaid, as a rule. Exceptional pilots tended to feel differently. He was arriving in 3 days. Maya was sitting in the far corner of the lounge with a cup of coffee and a technical manual open on the table in front of her. She wasn't part of any of the conversations, but she could hear them clearly enough. If Kincaid asks Hayes point blank who the best Apache pilot is, one of the officers said, and several people around him started laughing before he even finished the sentence. "Silence," someone else said. "That's what happens. The room just goes quiet." More laughter, the kind that came easily when everyone already understood the joke. Maya turned a page of her manual and kept reading. She was not angry. She had gotten past the kind of anger that shook your hands and shortened your breathing a long time ago. What she felt now was something quieter than that, something that had been sharpened by months of being passed over and talked past and politely sidelined until it was less an emotion and more a form of clarity. She knew exactly what she was capable of. She knew exactly what the numbers said. And she knew that none of that would matter until someone powerful enough to see it clearly was given the chance. Maybe Kincaid was that person. Maybe not. She wasn't going to build a plan around maybe. She finished her coffee, closed her manual, and stood up. Several people glanced at her as she moved through the room. None of them said anything. She walked out into the cool desert evening without looking back. 3 days later, the base was a different place. Not loudly different. Fort Carver was a professional operation, and nobody was going to let obvious nerves show in the open. But the undercurrent was unmistakable if you knew how to read it. People were standing straighter. Briefings were running longer. The flight line had been swept twice in one morning. Commander Shaw had somehow found time for 2 additional simulator sessions in the past 48 hours, which was notable for a man who usually treated the simulator like it was beneath him. Admiral Kincaid's visit was now less than 18 hours away, and on that particular morning, before any of the Admiral's business became relevant, the base had a training exercise to run. It was a battlefield rescue simulation, the kind of mission profile the Apache unit practiced regularly, designed around the scenario of a downed crew in hostile terrain that required low-altitude extraction with combat helicopter cover. 3 Apaches were scheduled to fly it. 6 pilots, all assigned. It was a high-visibility exercise in normal circumstances, and with Kincaid arriving the following morning, it had the attention of every senior officer on base. At 40 minutes before scheduled takeoff, Captain Travis Webb walked into the medical bay and didn't walk out again on his own. Webb was one of the assigned co-pilots. He had woken that morning with what turned out to be a severe abdominal cramp that medical quickly escalated into a suspected appendicitis concern. They put him on a cot and started an evaluation, and that was the end of Captain Webb's morning, which meant there was an empty seat in Lieutenant Aaron Cole's Apache 28 minutes before launch. Colonel Hayes took the news with the particular brand of controlled displeasure he reserved for problems that interrupted things he had already approved. He stood in his office with the duty officer delivering the update and said nothing for a long moment, then asked for a list of certified standby pilots. The duty officer read the list. It was short. 2 pilots were already deployed on a separate tasking to the South Range. One had just come off a 20-hour duty rotation and was legally unavailable. One was in the middle of a mandatory medical recertification. And Captain Maya Brooks was fully available, fully current, and certified on the specific Apache configuration assigned to Cole's team, the Block 3 variant with the upgraded sensor suite that not every pilot on base had completed qualification training for. Hayes sat down behind his desk. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "She stays in the co-pilot's seat," he said finally, as if he were negotiating terms. "Cole's aircraft. Cole leads. She follows his direction." He looked at the duty officer. "And this is purely logistical. She's not demonstrating anything. She's filling a slot." The duty officer nodded and went to find Captain Brooks. Maya got the news at the flight equipment cage, where she had been returning a headset for calibration. The duty officer delivered it in the clipped, impersonal way of someone conveying information without editorial, and she listened without interrupting. "A slot in Cole's Apache. 23 minutes to launch. Go get your gear." She went and got her gear. Cole was waiting at the helicopter when she arrived, doing a final walk-around inspection. He looked up when he saw her coming, and something in his expression relaxed, almost imperceptibly, as if a small tension had released. "Glad they called you," he said. "Glad I was on standby," she replied. She dropped her helmet bag at the nose of the aircraft and started her own walk-around from the opposite side, running her hands along the fuselage, checking the rotor head, testing the tail, rotor pivot. Routine muscle memory. "You're familiar with the Block 3 sensor configuration?" Cole asked. "Completed qualification on it 4 months ago," she said. "Before most of the squadron." "Right." He nodded. "Then you probably know it better than I do." She didn't respond to that. She climbed into the co-pilot's forward seat, began the startup sequence, and went through her checklist with the steady pace of someone who had done it enough times that it didn't require thought. Not because she was rushing, but because her hands and eyes knew the aircraft the way you know a language you grew up speaking. Behind them, the 2 other Apaches on the mission were going through their own starts. The whole process took 11 minutes, which was good time for a 3-ship formation on a compressed timeline. At T-4 minutes, Colonel Hayes appeared at the edge of the flight line and watched the aircraft without approaching. At T-2, Sergeant Ortega walked past Cole's Apache and gave the nose a quick pat with one flat palm. His version of good luck, the same thing he did every time Maya flew. At 0, the rotors came up to speed, and the 3 Apaches lifted off together into the pale morning desert sky. The training range occupied a stretch of high desert terrain about 30 miles northwest of the base, a mix of canyon country, low scrubland, and the kind of abrupt ridge terrain that made Apache flying genuinely technical. The mission profile called for the 3 helicopters to approach from the south, navigate a simulated threat corridor through a canyon system, extract a simulated down crew from a designated landing zone, and egress north without crossing 3 defined threat sectors. It was a complex profile. That was the point. Maya settled into the co-pilot seat and began doing what she always did in the first minutes of a flight: reading the terrain, reading the air, building a 3-dimensional picture of the environment around the aircraft. The desert below them was layered with thermal variation from the early morning heating cycle, and she could feel the slight differences in lift and drag as the helicopter moved through different air masses. Most pilots process this passively. Maya processed it actively, cataloging it, using it. "Wind from the southwest at about 12 knots at our altitude," she said over the intercom to Cole. "But there's a canyon funnel effect coming up on the approach at marker 4. It's going to feel like 15 to 18 once we drop below the ridge line." Cole glanced at his instruments. The forecast wind had been 11 knots. How do you know? Dust pattern on the ridge, she said. The way it's layering. And the scrub brush movement on the far wall. She paused. It'll push left on the nose as we come through the notch. If you compensate with right pedal early, you won't feel it much. Cole processed that. He was a good pilot. Confident without being reckless, genuinely skilled. And one of the things that made him good was that he didn't let his ego get in the way of useful information. Good catch, he said. I'll take it. The 3 helicopters descended toward the canyon approach, and Maya kept tracking the environment around them with the kind of continuous attention that looked effortless from the outside, but was actually the product of years of disciplined practice. The slight shift in blade pitch that told her the air was thinning faster than expected. The angle of the sun on the canyon walls that helped her build a shadow map of the terrain below. The way the 3rd Apache in the formation was sitting slightly nose-high, which meant its pilot was probably fighting a crosswind component he hadn't fully anticipated yet. At marker 4, the wind came through the canyon notch exactly as she had predicted. Cole applied the right pedal correction a half-second before the push, and the Apache moved through the notch smoothly, while the other 2 helicopters rocked briefly before their pilots recovered. Nice, Cole said quietly. The second one will be at marker 7, Maya said. Stronger. Come in 10 degrees off the center line and let the wind bring you back to track. You've flown this canyon before? No, she said. I've just read it. The simulated threat corridor was a series of radar emitters that the exercise controllers used to replicate surface-to-air missile coverage. Navigating it required staying below a precise altitude threshold while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid hovering in any one sector too long. The standard approach was to pick the widest gaps in coverage and go straight through. Maya had a different read on it. If we follow the standard corridor, we're going to be in Sector 3's coverage cone for 48 seconds, she said, pulling up the threat overlay on her display. But if we come over the ridge at the northwest corner, there's a dead angle in the radar sweep. About 12 seconds of coverage gap every 32 seconds. We can use the terrain to mask our approach. Cole considered it. That route adds distance. About 900 meters, she said. But we come out 2 kilometers closer to the extraction zone without any threat exposure. There was a brief pause. Walk me through it. She did. Cole approved the modified approach, related to the other 2 aircraft, and they adjusted their navigation accordingly. The 3 Apaches moved through the canyon system with a precision that the range controllers watching from the monitoring station later described as uncommonly clean. When the simulation reached the extraction zone, Cole's aircraft arrived 41 seconds ahead of the projected timeline, which was better than any previous run of this exercise profile. The mission controllers noted it. They were required to, heading home across the desert, with the morning sun fully up and the base visible as a cluster of low rooftops and antenna towers on the horizon. Cole keyed the intercom. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead, Maya said. The canyon wind at marker 4. The radar gap. The modified routing. He paused. Do you do that on every flight? Yes, she said simply. Does Hayes know? She was quiet for a moment. Hayes hasn't put me in an aircraft in 3 weeks, she said. So no. Cole didn't say anything for a while. The base grew larger ahead of them as they descended into the traffic pattern. He should know, Cole said. He should, Maya agreed. The debrief in the operations room lasted 40 minutes. The range controllers had recorded the metrics, and the lead evaluating officer walked through each aircraft's performance in sequence. When Cole's team came up, the numbers stood out clearly against the others. Faster mission completion, cleaner threat avoidance, 0 simulated exposure. The evaluating officer read through the timeline twice before commenting. Team 2 ran an unscheduled route modification in Sector 3, he said, looking up. Results suggest it was optimal. Whose call? Cole was sitting beside Maya at the debrief table. He paused for exactly 1 second. Joint decision, he said. Maya looked at the table. From across the room, Commander Derek Shaw leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and a skeptical expression arranged carefully on his face. The modified route worked in simulation, he said, but in a real engagement, that kind of last-minute deviation creates coordination problems for the whole formation. You get lucky in training, and then you depend on luck in combat. That's how people get killed. The evaluating officer looked at him. The deviation was communicated to all aircraft 30 seconds before execution, and all 3 teams confirmed. Shaw shrugged. I'm just saying real combat doesn't always give you 30 seconds. Nobody in the room called it what it was. They rarely did. After the debrief, as the pilots filtered out, Cole stopped beside Maya in the corridor. I'm going to start logging your input on mission decisions, he said. Time stamped. Formally. She looked at him. When Kincaid gets here tomorrow, he said, I want there to be a record. Maya held his gaze for a moment. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, Cole said. I'm doing it anyway. She nodded once, then walked back toward the hangar where Sergeant Ortega was already waiting to begin the post-flight inspection. Above them, the desert sky was clean and wide, and the Apaches sat in their rows on the tarmac, exactly as they had that morning, patient and still. And somewhere in the chain of events that had just quietly begun, something had shifted, small, almost invisible, but real. The test she was never meant to pass had turned out to be the easiest thing she'd done all week. The day after the training exercise, Fort Carver felt like a base holding its breath. Admiral Kincaid's arrival was now less than 48 hours away, and the shift in atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of collective tension that doesn't announce itself loudly, but shows up in the small things. Briefings that ran 5 minutes longer than they needed to. Officers double-checking uniform details they hadn't thought about in weeks. The flight line freshly swept for the second morning in a row, the Apaches wiped down to a shine that went well beyond operational necessity. Colonel Hayes had been in back-to-back meetings since early morning. The door to his office had been closed more often than not, and the small cluster of senior officers who rotated in and out were the focused expressions of people rehearsing a story they wanted to tell well. Maya watched all of it from a distance and said nothing. She had her own work to do. The preparation for Kincaid's visit included a formal demonstration sequence, a curated selection of the unit's pilots performing specific flight profiles that Hayes had personally chosen to showcase the base's capabilities. It was the kind of thing every base command assembled when an important evaluation was coming, controlled, polished, and carefully edited to highlight the best version of what the unit could do. Hayes had spent the better part of the previous evening selecting his roster for the demonstration. Maya's name was not on it. She found out the same way she found out about most things at Fort Carver. Not through any official channel, but through the informal current of information that moved through a base the way water finds its level. A comment overheard near the duty desk. A look exchanged between 2 officers who didn't know she was in earshot. By the time the demonstration roster was posted on the operations board that morning, she had already known for an hour. Her flight statistics surpassed nearly every pilot on the list. In several categories: reaction time in dynamic threat environments, precision in confined hover operations, instrument approach accuracy, she led the entire unit by a measurable margin. These were not informal impressions. They were numbers, logged and verified, sitting in the base's performance database for anyone willing to look. Hayes had looked. He had simply decided not to use what he saw. Aaron Cole went to Hayes' office at 10:15 that morning. He had thought carefully about how to approach it, and he had decided that the most effective argument was not a moral one, but a practical one. Hayes was a man who responded to risk, and Cole had identified the specific risk he wanted to put in front of him. He knocked, was told to enter, and stood in front of the desk with the calm of someone who had already decided they weren't going to back down. "Sir," he said, "I want to flag a concern about the demonstration roster." Hayes looked up from his paperwork with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had already prepared to be unmoved by it. "Cole, Captain Brooks' performance metrics are in the top tier of the unit across every logged category," Cole said. "If Admiral Kincaid reviews the base records, which his staff has already requested access to, as of this morning, and he sees that our highest-performing pilot wasn't included in the demonstration, it creates an explanation problem." Hayes set his pen down. The demonstration roster reflects operational balance. It's not a rankings exercise. "With respect, sir," Kincaid has a reputation for cross-referencing what he sees in a demonstration against what the data says. Cole kept his voice level. If those two things don't line up, he'll notice. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. The particular kind of quiet that meant he was calculating rather than dismissing. Captain Brooks is on standby during the demonstration period, he said finally. If a slot opens up, she's available. It was not what Cole had asked for. It was also not a no. He recognized the narrow gap in it. Understood, sir, he said and left. The rumor started somewhere in the lower NCO corridor and worked its way upward with the efficiency that base gossip always manages when the story is interesting enough. The version that reached Sergeant Ortega, through Specialist Darnell Webb in the maintenance bay, who had heard it from a supply clerk, who had apparently heard it from someone who knew someone, was that Maya Brooks had once washed out of a critical training exercise 3 years earlier, failed a night navigation evaluation, nearly caused a mid-air incident. Ortega was holding a wrench when he heard it. He set it down very carefully on the workbench. He knew the story being referenced. He knew it because he had been there, not on the aircraft, but at the base when it happened, part of the maintenance crew on standby during that evaluation period. The actual record showed something quite different from the version now circulating. During a particularly brutal night navigation exercise at Fort Drum, a training accident had developed when another pilot's instruments failed during a low-altitude approach. Maya had been flying the chase aircraft. She had identified the developing emergency before the tower did, gotten on the radio, guided the distressed aircraft through a manual recovery approach, and the pilot had landed safely. The exercise had been paused and eventually scored incomplete for the full group, including Maya, because the scenario had been compromised. She hadn't failed anything. She had saved someone. The story, now moving through the base, had carved out that entire center and replaced it with something that served a completely different purpose. Ortega pulled out his phone and called Cole. Cole didn't say anything for a long moment after Ortega finished. "How far has it spread?" he asked. "Far enough," Ortega said. "I heard it from 3 different people before lunch. Shaw's name keeps coming up adjacent to it. Nobody's saying he started it directly, but he started it," Cole said. Ortega didn't disagree. "I've been building a documentation file," Cole said. "Her mission contributions from the training exercise yesterday, time-stamped. Her performance logs going back 6 months. The radar gap analysis, the terrain routing. I logged all of it with her name attached before the debrief even finished." Ortega was quiet for a moment. "Does she know you're doing that?" "She knows." "Good," Ortega said. "Because right now, the people who know the truth are the ones who actually work around aircraft for a living. And we don't have offices with doors." That evening, Maya was alone in the simulator building. She had signed out a simulator block at 1800 hours, the last slot of the day, the one nobody wanted because it ran until almost 2100 and the building got cold when the air handling cycled down at sunset. She had the whole facility to herself, which was the way she preferred it. The simulation she had loaded was not on any training syllabus at Fort Carver. It was a scenario she had built herself over several months, pulling from published combat reports, declassified after-action reviews, and 2 technical manuals that most pilots at her level never read, because they described aircraft handling characteristics that were considered beyond practical operational parameters. The scenario simulated a single Apache operating in a narrow mountain valley at night, in degraded weather, with a partial sensor failure, against a dynamic threat environment that changed behavior based on the pilot's decisions. It was the kind of simulation that existed at the far edge of what the aircraft and its pilot could theoretically do together. She had run it 31 times. She had survived it, meaning she had completed the mission profile and returned the simulated aircraft safely to base 9 times. Tonight, she ran it twice more. The first run ended at the 14-minute mark when the simulated aircraft took a hit from a threat she had anticipated but couldn't fully evade given the terrain constraints. She replayed the decision point 3 times before resetting. The second run went 17 minutes before she brought the aircraft home. Not clean, the simulated fuselage showing 2 system warnings and a hydraulic flag, but home. She sat in the simulator cockpit for a minute after the second run, looking at the frozen display. Then she logged the results in her personal file, shut the system down, and began closing up the building. She was pulling on her jacket near the door when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Aaron Cole appeared in the doorway, still in his flight suit, a tablet under his arm. "Didn't know you were still here," he said, though his expression suggested he had suspected it. "Didn't know you were looking," she said. He came inside, glancing at the simulator she had just vacated. The display was dark, but the session log on the side panel was still visible. The scenario title, the 2 run attempts, the outcome ratings. He read the scenario title and looked at her. "That's not in the training library," he said. "No," she said. He looked at the outcome on the second run. 17 minutes. Mission complete. 2 system warnings. He stopped. "Maya, this is one of the most advanced scenarios in the Apache combat literature. I've read the reports this is based on. Most pilots who try this in simulation don't get past 10 minutes. "I know," she said. She picked up her bag. "Which is why I keep running it." Cole stood there for a moment. Then he turned the tablet toward her. "I want to show you something." It was a data summary. 6 months of her performance logs, compiled and formatted cleanly, with timestamps and verifiable source references. Mission contributions, simulator results, technical diagnoses, the training exercise from yesterday, with her route modification flagged and attributed. It was thorough, quiet work, the kind that would hold up to scrutiny. When Kincaid arrives, Cole said, "I'm going to make sure this gets in front of someone who will actually read it." Maya looked at the document for a long moment. She had spent over a year at Fort Carver doing everything right and being seen anyway as something less than she was. The document in Cole's hands represented something she had not been given, a record that told the truth in a language people with authority were required to take seriously. "Thank you," she said. It was simple, and she meant it without complication. Cole nodded. They walked out of the building together into the cold desert night, and above the airfield the stars were out in full, sharp and clear the way they only get in high desert air far from city light. Admiral Robert Kincaid's aircraft touched down at Fort Carver at 0900 the following morning, and the base felt the arrival before it heard it. There was something in the way the ground crew moved that was different from ordinary morning activity, a slight additional precision, a voluntary straightening of postures that no one had ordered. The duty officer who had been stationed at the arrival point since 0700 checked his watch twice in the final minutes before the wheels touched down, not because he needed to know the time, but because he needed to do something with his hands. When Kincaid stepped off the aircraft, it was immediately clear why he had the reputation he had. He was 61 years old, built like someone who had spent a career being compressed by G-forces and had simply become denser as a result. His uniform was impeccable, not in the careful, overpressed way of officers preparing for evaluation, but in the way of someone for whom correct presentation was so deeply habitual it required no thought. He moved across the tarmac with a long, unhurried stride, taking in the flight line with a slow pan of attention that looked casual and missed nothing. He shook Hayes' hand with the efficiency of a man performing a necessary formality. "Colonel, good flight line." Hayes began his prepared welcome. Kincaid listened for approximately 45 seconds before redirecting. Before the briefings, Kincaid said, "I'd like to walk the aircraft." Hayes blinked. The walkthrough wasn't scheduled until the afternoon. "Of course, sir. I can. Just me and your crew chief," Kincaid said. "No presentations. I just want to see what the birds look like up close." Hayes couldn't object to that. He gestured toward the flight line and called for Sergeant Ortega. Ortega met the Admiral at the first Apache in a row with the composed alertness of a man who had nothing to hide and knew it. Kincaid ran his eyes over the aircraft the way a horse trainer looks at a horse. Not at any one thing specifically, but at everything at once, reading the whole picture. He checked the rotor head, crouched and looked under the fuselage, ran a thumb along a panel seam that wasn't quite flush. He asked technical questions in a conversational tone, and Ortega answered them the same way. After about 15 minutes, as they stood near the nose of the fourth Apache in the line, Kincaid asked without preamble, "Who's your best pilot?" Ortega answered without hesitation, "Captain Maya Brooks, sir." Kincaid looked at him. "Not one of the names I was briefed on this morning." "No, sir." Ortega said. He kept his face neutral, his tone factual. She tends not to make the briefing materials. Kincaid held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Sergeant," and walked back toward the operations building at the same unhurried pace. The formal briefing with the senior officers lasted 90 minutes and covered operational readiness, maintenance cycles, training metrics, and the unit's recent exercise performance. Kincaid sat at the head of the conference table and asked questions that were pointed enough to require actual answers rather than prepared talking points. Hayes navigated it with practiced competence, steering toward the parts of the unit's performance he was proud of and away from the parts he wasn't. Kincaid let him navigate for a while. Then, near the end of the briefing, he opened the performance database summary that his staff had pulled the previous day and flipped to a specific page. "I want to ask about this pilot," he said, and set the document on the table where Hayes could see it. It was Maya's performance record. Top-line metrics. 6 months of data. Hayes looked at it. A particular stillness came over his face. "Captain Brooks," he said. "Good technical pilot. Still developing her operational instincts. Her instrument approach accuracy is the highest in the unit by 4%, Kincaid said, in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Her dynamic threat reaction time is 0.2 of a second faster than the next pilot in the ranking. Her simulator advanced scenario scores are," he glanced at the page, "classified as exceptional in 3 separate categories." He looked up. What does "still developing" mean in that context? The room had gone very quiet. Hayes said, carefully, "Combat instinct is something that develops in the field, Admiral. Metrics don't always capture the full picture." Combat instinct Kincaid repeated. He set the document down and looked at the assembled officers. "I've heard that phrase used many times in my career, mostly when the person using it couldn't find a better reason for a decision they'd already made." He did not say it with particular heat. He said it the way you state something that is simply true. "I'd like to observe Captain Brooks fly tomorrow morning. Routine exercise. No special scenario." Hayes opened his mouth. Closed it. "Of course, sir." Across the base, the demonstration that Hayes had organized was going ahead on schedule. Commander Derek Shaw was the centerpiece of it. He flew 2 consecutive profiles that afternoon, a low-altitude terrain run and a simulated engagement scenario, and he flew them with the polished confidence of a man performing for an audience he believed was watching closely. His technique was genuinely good. Crisp transitions, clean hover entries, no wasted movement. He had put in the extra simulator hours, and it showed. Kincaid watched both profiles from a position near the observation deck, standing slightly apart from the other officers. He held a cup of coffee and said almost nothing for the duration of both flights. When Shaw landed and climbed out of the cockpit, there was a moment, brief, visible if you knew where to look, where he glanced up toward the observation deck to see the Admiral's reaction. Kincaid was already looking at the flight data on his tablet. Shaw's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He pulled off his gloves and walked toward the debrief room. One of the junior officers standing near Hayes said, quietly, "Shaw flew well." Hayes nodded. He always does. What neither of them said was what both of them were thinking. That Kincaid's expression during the entire demonstration had been the expression of a man doing a crossword puzzle. Engaged, unhurried, and not particularly surprised by anything. That evening, Cole found a quiet moment and got the data file in front of the right person. He had spent some time thinking about the correct channel. Going directly to Kincaid was above his rank in a way that could backfire. But Kincaid's aide, a lieutenant commander named Paulson, who was sharp, organized, and clearly the person who actually prepared everything the Admiral looked at, was approachable if you had something genuinely worth his time. Cole caught Paulson in the corridor outside the visitor quarters just after 1900. He was brief. He had 6 months of log performance data, time-stamped and verifiable, for a pilot who consistently outperformed the rest of the unit but had been systematically excluded from visible assignments. He handed over the tablet with the document open. Paulson read the summary page in about 45 seconds. "This is your documentation?" he asked. "Mission logs, simulator scores, a specific exercise contribution from 2 days ago with real-time timestamps," Cole said. "It's all verifiable against the base records." Paulson looked at him for a moment. The Admiral already asked about this pilot. Cole kept his expression even. I know. Paulson took the tablet. I'll make sure he has this before the morning. Maya knew none of this. She had spent the evening in the standard routine, post-duty maintenance walk, equipment check, a meal in the dining facility, and an early night because she had a systems check flight scheduled for first thing the next morning. A routine flight. Nothing special. She had been given the assignment through the normal scheduling channel, and she had accepted it the same way she accepted every assignment, without comment, without ceremony, with the quiet determination of someone who shows up and does the work regardless of whether anyone is watching. She set her alarm for 05:30, laid out her gear, and went to sleep. She didn't know that the Admiral had requested the observation. She didn't know about the data file Cole had put in front of his aide. She didn't know that Sergeant Ortega, in a 30-second conversation near the nose of an Apache that morning, had told the most powerful aviator in the room the truth without being asked. She just knew she had a flight in the morning. That was enough. The control tower at Fort Carver had a large observation window on its upper level that looked directly down the primary runway and across the full breadth of the flight line. In the early morning, with the desert air still clear before the day's heat built its shimmer above the tarmac, it was the best vantage point on the base. At 0640, Colonel Hayes arrived at the tower for what he believed was a routine morning observation shift. He found Admiral Kincaid already there, standing at the window with a cup of coffee and a stillness that suggested he had been there for a while. Several other officers were present, Shaw among them, who had come up to the tower with Hayes and now stood slightly to one side with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something professional and composed. Below on the flight line, a single Apache was going through its startup sequence. The pre-flight walk-around had already been completed. The rotors were beginning their slow initial rotation, building toward operating speed. In the cockpit, Maya ran through her checklist with the same unhurried precision she always brought to it. She had no passengers today. This was a solo systems check, a 30-minute flight to verify avionics integration on an Apache that had just come out of maintenance. Standard procedure. She had no idea anyone was paying particular attention. Kincaid watched the startup sequence from the observation window. He said nothing. He watched the way the pilot moved through the pre-departure checks, the efficiency of the hand movements, the way the head turned at each verification point, the small subtle adjustments that indicated someone integrating information from multiple systems simultaneously rather than working through a linear list. He set his coffee cup down. Hayes noticed the gesture and felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, though he couldn't have said exactly what. Below them, the Apache's rotors came up to full operating speed. The sound built through the tower windows, the deep, rhythmic percussion of an AH-64 at power, a sound that hit you somewhere below the ribcage when you were close to it. The helicopter began to lift. Kincaid leaned slightly forward. "Let's see what this pilot can really do," he said quietly, to no one in particular. The Apache rose cleanly off the runway, and the morning opened up around it. The Apache lifted off the runway at 0652. Maya felt the familiar moment of separation from the ground. That half second where the helicopter stops being a machine sitting on pavement and becomes something else entirely, something alive in 3 dimensions, and she let it settle into her body the way it always did. She brought the aircraft up to 50 feet, held the hover, ran her eyes across the instrument panel and the sequence she had used so many times it was less a habit than a reflex. Everything read clean. She keyed the radio and gave departure control her position and intentions, received acknowledgement, and began climbing toward her assigned operating altitude. It was a systems check flight. 30 minutes, maybe 35. She would run the avionics integration sequence, verify the targeting and navigation systems were reading correctly following the maintenance work, do a brief handling check to confirm the aircraft felt balanced, and bring it home. Routine, necessary, unremarkable. The kind of flight that kept the aircraft ready for the flights that mattered. She had no idea there was anyone in the tower watching her. At 200 feet, she leveled briefly and let the aircraft settle, feeling the way it sat in the air. After any significant maintenance cycle, a helicopter has a slightly different personality, Small things shift in the way it responds, the way the controls feel underfoot and in the hands. An experienced pilot reads these differences the way a doctor reads a pulse. Maya noticed a slight tendency to drift left during the level hold, made a mental note, and began her climb toward the operating area. In the tower above and behind her, Admiral Kincaid had not moved from the window. The operating area for the system's check was a designated block of airspace about 12 miles northwest of the field, over a flat stretch of desert with enough separation from other traffic to allow freedom of movement. Maya reached it in 7 minutes, announced her entry on the radio, and began the avionics integration sequence. The sequence ran in phases. Navigation system first. She checked the GPS integration, the terrain database loading, the waypoint accuracy against 3 known ground reference points. Everything nominal. Then the communication systems, cycling through the frequency ranges, checking encryption synchronization, verifying the data link handshake with the base tower. Clean. She moved into the sensor integration phase, bringing up the targeting system's optical and infrared channels and running them through their calibration checks. The first channel came up clean. The second came up clean. On the third channel, the forward-looking infrared targeting integration, the display flickered. Maya watched it for a moment without touching anything. The flicker repeated, irregular, about 3 seconds apart. She pulled up the fault codes. The system was throwing an integration error between the targeting computer's processing core and the secondary sensor bus, the same bus that fed targeting data to the weapons systems and the navigation overlay simultaneously. It was a specific fault, one she had seen before, one she had in fact diagnosed and flagged for maintenance on a different aircraft less than 2 weeks earlier. The fault was consistent with a calibration error in the multiplexer board, or it was consistent with something worse, a hardware fault in the processing core itself, which was a significantly more serious problem. She needed to determine which. She ran the manual diagnostic cycle. While it processed, she kept the helicopter straight and level and listened to the aircraft with the part of her attention that didn't require instruments. The sound of the engines, the vibration pattern through the airframe, the feel of the controls under her hands. Nothing there suggested a deeper problem. The aircraft felt right. The fault was in the electronics, not the mechanical systems. The diagnostic returned. It pointed to the secondary bus, not the core. She noted it, flagged it for the post-flight report, and moved on to the next phase of the check sequence. She would handle the navigation display with the primary systems only. It was a limitation, not a crisis. Up to this point, everything she had done was textbook. Identify, assess, adapt, continue. That was the sequence. That was what you trained for. Then the display went wrong in a way she hadn't anticipated. The flickering didn't stop. It accelerated. What had been an intermittent 3-second cycle became continuous. The navigation overlay on her primary display suddenly flooding with corrupted data, position readings jumping, the terrain mapping layer washing in and out in a strobing pattern that made the display nearly unreadable. The targeting system's error had cascaded into the primary navigation feed in a way the diagnostic hadn't predicted, which meant the fault was more complex than she had initially assessed. Within 2 seconds, she had made 3 decisions. The first was to switch the navigation system to manual override and isolate the corrupted bus from the primary display feed. The second was to cross-check her position using the backup radio navigation system, which operated on entirely separate hardware. The third was to begin building a mental terrain map using the visual references visible through the cockpit glass. The ridgeline to the northwest, the straight line of a desert road below, and to her left, the angle of the base tower visible in the far distance. The manual override engaged. The corrupted display cleared to a simplified readout showing only the data the override protocol could verify as clean. It was less information than she was used to flying with. It was enough. In the tower at Fort Carver, the air traffic controller, watching Maya's telemetry, sat up straighter in his seat. "She's just lost her navigation overlay," he said, not loudly, to the room in general. Several people turned toward the display screens. Commander Shaw, standing at the far end of the tower observation window, shifted his weight and said nothing. His expression had changed, though. The professional composure he had been wearing all morning had acquired a new quality, something tighter, something watchful. Colonel Hayes moved closer to the controller station and looked at the telemetry readout. Is she declaring emergency? Negative, the controller said. No emergency call. She's just flying. Kincaid hadn't moved from the window. He was watching the Apache, which was still describing a clean, controlled arc in the operating area, moving without any visible sign of distress. His hands were folded behind his back, and his expression was one of careful, complete attention. Maya spent the next 4 minutes flying the aircraft on visual references and backup navigation while she worked through the fault in a methodical sequence. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't fighting the situation. She was working with it, the way you work with bad weather or difficult terrain, not against the conditions but through them, using what was available. She identified the cascade path. The multiplexer board fault had triggered an error handling loop in the navigation software that hadn't been caught by the diagnostic because it only manifested under the specific load conditions of the avionics integration check. It was a known theoretical failure mode. She had read about it in one of the technical manuals she kept in her quarters, a document most pilots at her level had never opened. She knew the manual reset sequence. She ran it. The navigation overlay stabilized. The fault codes dropped from 5 to 1, and the remaining fault was the original multiplexer issue. Isolated, flagged, no longer cascading. Her displays came back clean. She held the hover for 15 seconds and ran her eyes across every instrument on the panel, top to bottom, left to right, the way you do after a fault resolution before you do anything else. Everything read correctly. The aircraft was sound. She keyed the radio. Power, this is Brooks. Had a NAV system fault during the check sequence. Isolated and resolved via manual override and reset protocol. All systems nominal now. Continuing check sequence unless you want me to come home early. In the tower, the controller looked at the telemetry. Everything was clean. He looked at Hayes. Hayes was staring at the display with the expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he didn't fully understand. Your call, sir, the controller said. Tell her to continue, Hayes said after a moment. Maya completed the remaining check sequence and brought the Apache home 17 minutes later. The approach was smooth. The landing was the kind that experienced pilots describe as a grease job. The helicopter settling onto the tarmac so cleanly that the transition from air to ground was almost imperceptible. The rotors were winding down when she began her post-flight shutdown procedure. In the tower, nobody said anything for a moment after the Apache touched down. Shaw uncrossed his arms. He looked at the tarmac below with the expression of someone making a quick calculation. Sensor fault during a maintenance check flight, he said, in the tone of someone offering context. Aircraft had just come out of maintenance. Could be residual from the work. One of the other officers nodded, the automatic nod of someone who wants the explanation to be simpler than it is. Kincaid turned from the window. He didn't look at Shaw. He looked at Hayes. He looked at him for a long, unhurried moment with the calm assessment of a man who had spent his career evaluating people in high-pressure moments and had become very good at reading the difference between performance and substance. Then he said, quietly, why exactly is your best pilot not leading this unit? The question landed in the room without particular drama, the way a very heavy object lands when it's been set down rather than dropped. Hayes opened his mouth. Nothing immediately came out. Her operational development, he began. She just lost her navigation system in the middle of a flight and resolved the cascade fault in under 5 minutes using manual override and a reset sequence that isn't in the standard checklist, Kincaid said. Without declaring emergency. Without breaking her flight profile. He paused. Walk me through the operational development concern. The room was very quiet. Hayes closed his mouth. Several of the officers near the back of the tower were looking at the floor, or at the windows, or at anything other than their commanding officer's face. Kincaid turned back toward the window. Below on the tarmac, Maya was climbing out of the Apache cockpit. She pulled off her helmet and ran a hand through her hair, then picked up her kneeboard and began walking toward the maintenance station to file her post-flight report. She moved without hurry, without performance, without any apparent awareness that anything unusual had just happened. "I want a full briefing on this pilot," Kincaid said. "Everything. Flight record, evaluation history, assignment log." He picked up his coffee cup from the windowsill. "And I want to know why it isn't on the top of Hayes' desk already." He walked toward the tower stairs. The officers parted to let him through. Shaw watched him go. Then he looked out the window at Maya, who was handing her post-flight notes to Ortega at the maintenance station below. His expression was no longer composed. Resentment, when it has been building for a long time, doesn't announce itself when it finally moves into action. It just finds a door that's unlocked. The attention Maya received in the hours following her systems check flight was not loud or obvious, but it was real. Kincaid's question in the tower had moved through the base's officer layer the way a frequency moves through a medium. Not the words themselves, which only a handful of people had actually heard, but the understanding that something had shifted. Pilots who had spent months treating Maya's presence as background noise found themselves noticing her at the fuel desk, in the debrief corridor, crossing the flight line. There was a different quality to the noticing now, a recalibration happening in real time. For the people who had spent that same time carefully managing her reputation downward, this shift felt like a threat. Shaw watched it all with a face that didn't change much. He sat in the officers' lounge that afternoon, a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and ran the situation through his mind with the same tactical precision he applied to flight problems. The Admiral had noticed. The question had been asked publicly. The performance record, whatever that file was that Paulson had been seen reading the previous night, was now almost certainly in Kincaid's hands. The window for an alternative narrative was closing. So he did what people do when the truth is moving against them, and they have enough access and enough accumulated trust to interfere with it. He went quiet, and he went to work. The conversation he had with Captain Nate Fulton that evening was casual in the way that deliberate conversations are casual when someone wants them to seem accidental. They were both in the corridor outside the operations room, both heading toward the parking lot, and Shaw brought it up as if it had just occurred to him. "You know what bothers me about that flight this morning?" he said, not really as a question. "The fault she handled. The navigation cascade." Fulton glanced at him. "She handled it clean." "She did," Shaw agreed. "But here's the thing. That aircraft came out of full maintenance cycle yesterday. A cascade fault in the NAV integration doesn't just appear after a full maintenance cycle, unless either the maintenance missed something or he paused just long enough. The fault was already there before the flight, and the pre-flight checks didn't catch it." Fulton was quiet. "My concern is the pre-flight protocol," Shaw said. "Not the handling. The handling was fine. But if she's cutting corners on pre-flight verification and covering it with in-flight recovery, that's a different conversation." He shrugged, easy and uninvested. "I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's worth asking." He said goodnight and walked to his car. He knew Fulton would pass it on. Fulton always passed things on. He was that kind of officer, not malicious, just unable to hold information quietly. By morning, the question would be circulating in a version slightly more definitive than the version Shaw had planted, the way these things always grew in transit. Sergeant Luis Ortega found it during the late evening maintenance inspection. He ran a post-flight on every Apache that had flown that day, which was standard practice, and he was working through Maya's aircraft methodically when he reached the targeting system panel. He pulled the secondary bus housing, checked the multiplexer board, the same board he and Maya had identified as oxidized on a different aircraft 2 weeks earlier, and stopped. The board had been recently handled, not by his team. He knew the difference between the marks his people left and the marks someone else left, the small evidence of how tools had been applied, which screws had been turned, and in what sequence. His team had done a full maintenance cycle on this aircraft the previous day and had replaced the multiplexer board with a new unit as part of the avionics overhaul. The board currently in the housing was not new. It was an older board, Ortega could tell by the part marking, and it had been deliberately under-torqued in the housing mount, which would cause intermittent contact failure under the vibration loads of active flight. Someone had pulled the new board and put an old, incorrectly seated one in its place after the maintenance cycle was signed off. Ortega crouched there in the access bay for a long moment without moving. He understood exactly what he was looking at. The fault during Maya's flight had not been a residual maintenance issue or an undiscovered pre-existing problem. It had been installed, deliberately, by someone with enough access to the aircraft and enough technical knowledge to make the swap look like a marginal issue rather than sabotage. The kind of thing that in a post-flight investigation could be explained away as a misstep in a maintenance sign-off. If Maya had been a less capable pilot, the cascade fault would have been significantly harder to manage. At low altitude, in a training scenario, it might not have been catastrophic. But if the same fault had developed during the upcoming wildfire response mission, which had been appearing on the operational schedule for 2 days, triggered by Forestry Service updates about fire conditions in the mountains to the east, the consequences would have been different. Ortega pulled the board, bagged it, labeled it with the time and his name, and called Cole. Cole answered on the second ring. He listened without interrupting while Ortega described what he had found. When Ortega finished, there was a silence of about 4 seconds. "You're certain it's not maintenance error," Cole said. It wasn't a question, but he needed to say it. "I built this aircraft's maintenance cycle myself this week," Ortega said. "I signed the board replacement personally. The board in there right now is not the board I installed." Another silence. "Where are you?" "Third bay. I've got the board bagged." "Don't put it back," Cole said. "Don't tell anyone else yet. I'm coming." He was there in 6 minutes. They stood together in the maintenance bay under the fluorescent lighting with the bag board on the workbench between them, and Cole looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he set security footage. "I pulled it already," Ortega said. He had his tablet out. "The bay camera covers the first 2/3 of the access area. Whoever did this knew the coverage angle." He turned the tablet toward Cole. The footage showed the relevant time window, and it showed a partial figure in the outer edge of the frame. Not identifiable, but clearly present, clearly working on the aircraft in the window between the end of the maintenance cycle sign-off and the pre-dawn hours before Maya's flight. The build of the figure, the way they moved. Cole looked at it for a long time. "That's not enough for a formal accusation," he said. "No," Ortega agreed. "But it's enough for a report." Cole straightened up. "I'm going to Kincaid's aid tonight." Ortega looked at him. "Hayes should be Kincaid's aid," Cole said again, firmly. "Given what we're looking at, I'm not routing this through the command structure that the problem is sitting inside." Ortega held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. He handed Cole the bagboard. Cole found Lieutenant Commander Paulson in the visitor quarters common room at 2100 hours, working through a stack of briefing materials with a pen in his hand and a methodical efficiency that suggested he kept these hours regularly. He looked up when Cole appeared in the doorway. "Lieutenant," he said. "I need 5 minutes," Cole said. "I have physical evidence of equipment tampering on a flight aircraft and security footage of unauthorized access to a maintenance bay. I'm bringing it here because I don't believe the appropriate oversight channel is currently neutral." Paulson set his pen down. Cole laid it out in the direct, sequenced way he had organized it during the 6-minute walk across the base. The replaced board, the timing, the cascade fault during Maya's flight that morning, the connection to the upcoming emergency mission, the security footage partial image. He put the bag board on the table and set the tablet with the footage beside it. Paulson looked at both of them without touching either. He asked 3 questions. Cole answered all 3. Then Paulson picked up the board and looked at the part marking. "I'll brief the Admiral in the morning," he said. "First thing." Cole nodded. "You did right bringing this here," Paulson said. He looked at Cole steadily. "Go get some sleep." Maya didn't know any of it. She was asleep by 2200, the way she had trained herself to be, because sleep deprivation degraded reaction time in measurable increments, and she had never been willing to sacrifice the fractions of a second that the difference between well-rested and tired cost a pilot in a difficult situation. She had filed her post-flight report, eaten dinner, read 30 pages of a novel she had been working through slowly for the past month, and gone to bed. She had noted, with a mild professional interest, that the fault she had handled that morning had been more complex than a standard multiplexer issue should produce. She had written in her logbook, the personal one she kept separately from the official records, that the cascade behavior was worth flagging to maintenance for a closer look at the software interaction between the bus integration protocol and the navigation overlay. She had written it as a technical observation, not a suspicion. She did not know her instinct about the fault was correct. She did not know it had been manufactured. What she did know, when she reported to the hangar the following morning and found the duty officer waiting with an assignment order, was that she had been given a mission. The Forestry Service had upgraded the wildfire alert to an emergency response request. The fire, which had been working eastward through dry mountain terrain for 2 days, had shifted with a wind change and was now moving toward a civilian community at the mountain's base. Evacuation was underway, but moving slowly. They needed aerial support, coordination, visibility, and the helicopter presence that could help ground crews navigate the smoke and identify safe egress routes. Hayes had signed the order personally. Whether because Kincaid's question the previous morning had made refusal too visible, or because there was simply no one else available with the right qualifications, or some combination of both, Maya's name was at the top of the response assignment. She was leading the mission. She stood at the duty desk and read the order twice. It was not the moment for any particular feeling. It was a mission, and there were people in danger, and she was the most qualified pilot available. She folded the order, put it in her flight suit pocket, and walked toward the hangar to find Ortega. He was already at her aircraft, running a fresh inspection. He had been there since before dawn. When he saw her coming, he looked up, and something in his expression, the steady, grounded look of a man who had done everything he could do and was now watching the outcome reach the person it was about, made her pause for just a moment. "She's clean," he said. "I went through everything personally." She looked at him. "Everything, everything," he said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the word required. She understood, without more explanation, that he was telling her something he couldn't fully say in a flight line hangar with people moving around them. She filed it away, in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be addressed after a mission instead of before it. "Thank you, Luis," she said. She put on her helmet and climbed into the cockpit. Across the hangar, Shaw watched her from the shadows near the equipment bay. His face was difficult to read. Something had gone out of the careful arrangement of his expression, leaving something rawer and less controlled underneath. He watched the Apache's rotors begin to turn. He watched Ortega give the nose a pat with his flat palm, the same small ritual he always performed. Then he looked up toward the control tower and saw the silhouette of Admiral Kincaid at the observation window, watching the flight line with the same steady, focused attention he had brought to everything since he arrived. Shaw looked away first. Above the runway, the Apache lifted into the smoke-hazed morning sky, and Maya pointed its nose toward the mountains. The mountains were already burning when the Apaches arrived. Maya could see the fire from 12 miles out, a ragged orange line working along the ridge, smoke columns rising in thick, dark towers that bent eastward in the upper winds before spreading into a brown haze that swallowed the sky above the valley. From altitude, it looked almost organized, almost manageable. She knew from the briefing that it wasn't either of those things. The wind had shifted twice in the past 6 hours, and the fire had followed it both times, moving in directions the ground crews hadn't anticipated. A civilian community of about 400 people sat at the base of the eastern slope, and the evacuation convoy was moving too slowly on a single mountain road that the smoke was beginning to reach. She keyed her radio. "Archer flight, this is Archer 1. We're 8 miles from the operational area. Tighten the formation and drop to 500 feet. The smoke columns are going to break up our visual spacing above 1,000. 2 acknowledgments came back. The other Apaches slid closer in the formation, and the 3 helicopters descended together into the lower airspace where the smoke began to reach them in drifting fingers. Not thick enough yet to cut visibility to 0, but enough to turn the air brown at the edges and make the terrain below look like it was being slowly erased. Maya read the landscape as they came in. The mountain's eastern face dropped in a series of stepped ridges, each one separated by a narrow valley that the fire was using as a channel. The smoke was heaviest in those channels, pushed by the same terrain-funneled wind that had made the fire so difficult to predict. She could see the evacuation road below, a pale gray line threading through the scrub timber, and she could see the convoy on it, a slow chain of vehicles working toward the valley floor. She could also see, about 2 miles ahead of the convoy's current position, where the smoke was thickest, where the road ran through a narrow cut between two ridges before it opened onto the safer terrain below. That cut was going to be a problem. Archer 2, Archer 3, she said. The road runs through a terrain cut at grid reference November 4. Smoke is heavy in that channel. I need one of you to get low enough to give me a visual on wind speed and direction inside the cut. I'll hold the upper position and coordinate with ground crews. Archer 2, Lieutenant Cole, responded immediately. Copy, Archer 1, descending for a look. Cole took his Apache down to 300 feet and flew a slow arc past the cut's entrance. The smoke inside it was dense, gray-brown, and swirling, but not impenetrable. He reported back in clipped, precise terms. Wind at approximately 20 knots inside the channel, gusting, direction variable between southwest and west, visibility about a quarter mile at his altitude. Maya processed it. 20-knot variable wind in a narrow channel with a convoy of civilian vehicles trying to pass through was manageable if the smoke didn't thicken further. The fire's nearest edge was moving parallel to the road at the moment, not toward it, but parallel could become toward very quickly if the wind shifted again. She got on the ground frequency. Convoy lead, this is Army Aviation Archer 1 overhead. You have approximately 14 minutes before the smoke in the cut ahead reaches obscuring levels. Your current speed puts you at the cut entrance in about 18. You need to increase speed. The convoy lead came back, a county emergency manager, his voice tight and controlled. We have elderly residents in 3 of the vehicles. Increasing speed on this road creates injury risk. I understand, Maya said. I'm going to station 1 helicopter at the cut exit to give you continuous visibility on conditions. You increase to safe maximum speed, and we'll keep your window open as long as we can. If conditions deteriorate before you clear, I'll call it and you stop. Understood. A pause. Then, understood. Archer 1. Increasing speed. She turned back to the formation frequency. Archer 3. Position at the cut exit, 150 feet, and give me a continuous read on smoke density and wind inside the channel. Archer 2. Hold with me at the upper position. Both aircraft acknowledged and moved. For the next 9 minutes, Maya ran the entire airspace with the focused, almost quiet authority of someone doing exactly what they were trained to do. She coordinated between the convoy, the 2 other Apaches, and the fire ground crews working the eastern slope, building a continuous picture of the situation from 3 separate streams of radio information and processing it faster than anyone on the ground could have managed from a fixed position. The convoy entered the cut at the 11-minute mark. At the 13-minute mark, the wind shifted. Maya felt it in her own aircraft first. The subtle change in pressure that meant the upper wind had swung 15 degrees south, which would push the smoke column directly into the cut's centerline within minutes. She was already keying her radio before she had consciously finished the analysis. Archer 3. Give me current density in the channel. Increasing. Archer 3's pilot reported back. Fast. It's coming in from the south wall. Convoy lead. You are past the midpoint of the cut. Do not stop. Maintain speed and continue. You will exit before the smoke closes. She paused for exactly 1 second. I'm certain of this. Keep moving. She was certain because she had done the geometry in her head. The convoy's current speed, the distance to the exit, the rate at which the smoke column would travel, given the wind shift she had just measured. The numbers worked. Barely, but they worked. Archer 3's pilot reported visibility dropping to 1/8 of a mile inside the channel. The convoy kept moving. Then Archer 2's engine warning went off. Cole's voice came over the radio with the trained calm of a pilot managing an emergency. Steady, informative, no wasted words. Archer 1. Archer 2. About engine temperature spiking on the primary. Ash ingestion, I think. Losing power on the right side. Maya's attention split without fracturing. She kept part of it on the convoy's position, still moving, still in the cut, 40 seconds from the exit, and turned the other part fully toward Cole's situation. Archer 2, what's your altitude and heading? 400 feet, heading 040. Power loss is gradual, not sudden. I have control. There's a flat clearing at your 2 o'clock, approximately 900 meters. Daí riverved, no obstructions. I need you to begin a gradual descent toward it now. Do not attempt to hold altitude. I see it, Cole said. I'm going to talk you down. Reduce collective slowly and let the aircraft settle. Do not fight the power loss. Work with it. She held the upper position and managed both situations simultaneously, her voice going back and forth between the convoy frequency and Cole's aircraft with the precision of someone splitting a perfectly calibrated instrument, giving each channel exactly what it needed at exactly the right moment. The convoy exited the cut at the 43-second mark. The convoy lead's voice came over the radio with an involuntary relief in it that he hadn't managed to keep professional. We're clear. All vehicles accounted for. Cole's Apache touched down in the riverbed 22 seconds later. Hard but controlled. The aircraft stayed upright, the rotors wound down without incident, and Cole's voice came back over the radio. Archer 2 is down. I'm okay. Aircraft is okay. I think. Maya let out a breath she hadn't been aware she was holding. Archer 3, take the upper position and maintain coordination with ground crews, she said. I'm going to Cole's position. She brought her Apache down in a slow circle toward the riverbed, watching Cole's helicopter from above. The aircraft was sitting at a slight angle on the uneven ground, but structurally intact. Cole was visible through the cockpit glass, running his post-emergency shutdown sequence. She landed 50 meters away and stayed in her cockpit, back on the radio, coordinating the handoff of airspace control to the fire management team that was now moving to take over the coordination role as the immediate crisis resolved. She managed that transition for 11 more minutes before she was satisfied it was clean. Then she shut down, climbed out, walked across the riverbed to Cole's aircraft, and looked at the engine nacelle. The ash deposits around the intake were heavy. He had been flying directly through the thickest smoke for the entire lower altitude phase. It was a maintenance issue, not a pilot error issue. Cole climbed down from the cockpit and stood beside her. He looked like someone who had just come through something and was still processing it. You talked me down while simultaneously keeping the convoy moving, he said. The convoy was the priority, she said. You kept both. She looked at the engine nacelle for another moment. Can you walk? Yes. Then let's get you to the ground crew. Back at Fort Carver, Admiral Kincaid sat in the mission monitoring room and listened to every radio transmission from the operation as it came in. His aide, Paulson, sat beside him with a notepad and wrote down nothing, because everything was being recorded and Paulson was smart enough to know that Kincaid retained what he needed without help. They listened to Maya coordinate the convoy through the cut. They listened to her manage Cole's emergency. They listened to the clean, authoritative handoff to the fire management team at the end. When the last transmission closed out and the room settled into the ordinary ambient noise of a monitoring station returning to standby, Kincaid sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She didn't outrank any of those pilots today." Paulson looked at him. Technically, she had no authority to give orders to the other aircraft, Kincaid said. She issued directions anyway, and every pilot in that airspace followed them without question. He paused, because the directions were right, and they knew it. He stood up. Give me the full mission recording for the briefing tomorrow. Every transmission. I want to play it in the room. Yes, sir, Paulson said. Kincaid looked at the now quiet monitoring screens for a moment longer. That woman didn't just fly well today, he said quietly. She saved every pilot in the sky. Morning came to Fort Carver with the flat, clear light of the high desert after a smoke-hazed day. The air washed clean by a wind shift overnight. The sky a hard pale blue from horizon to horizon. The Apaches sat in their rows on the tarmac, and the base moved through its early routines with the careful, slightly elevated energy of a unit that knew something important was about to happen. The main hangar had been set for a formal briefing. Rows of chairs faced the front where a podium and a projection screen had been arranged, and by 0730 the aviation unit was assembling in full. Pilots, crew chiefs, ground personnel, senior staff. The chairs filled from the front. People stood along the walls when the seats ran out. The room had the focused, electric quiet of an audience that already understood this was not a routine debrief. Colonel Hayes stood near the front, to the left of the podium, his hands behind his back and his face arranged into the professional neutrality of a man who had spent the night thinking very carefully about the next several hours. He had been briefed at 0600 by Paulson on the evidence Cole and Ortega had submitted the previous night. The conversation had been short and precise, and Hayes had said very little during it because there was very little to say that would have helped the situation. Commander Shaw stood in the second row, arms crossed, face closed. He had the look of someone who had arrived at a reckoning and was still deciding how to hold himself through it. Maya sat in the front row, at the end nearest the aisle, in her duty uniform with her hands resting in her lap. She did not know the full shape of what was about to happen. She knew that Kincaid was delivering his final evaluation. She knew the wildfire mission had gone well. She knew that Ortega's expression the previous morning had told her something she still hadn't been given the words to. She sat straight and waited. Admiral Kincaid walked in at 0745, and the room came to attention with a scraping of chairs and the flat sound of boots on the hangar floor. He told them to sit, and they did. He stood at the podium for a moment without speaking, looking at the assembled unit with the calm, reading attention he brought to everything, and then he began. He started with the wildfire mission. Not as praise, not yet. He walked through it analytically first, the way he would walk through any operation, describing the conditions and the challenges and the decisions that had been made at each critical point. He described the wind shift and the smoke density in the cut. He described the engine emergency that had developed mid-mission and the simultaneous demands it had placed on the mission commander. He described the outcome: 0 casualties, convoys safely extracted, downed aircraft recovered, all crews accounted for. He played 3 radio transmissions from the mission recording. The room listened to Maya's voice coordinating the convoy through the cut, talking cold down to the riverbed, and managing the handoff to the fire management team. In the context of the hangar, with the full room listening, the transmissions had a quality that they hadn't quite had in the monitoring room. You could hear the clarity of the thinking in them, the economy of the language, the precise calibration of what each person needed to hear and when. When the third transmission finished, the room was very still. Kincaid looked up from the podium. "I want to go back one day," he said, "to a systems check flight. A routine maintenance verification. An aircraft with a navigation fault that developed in the air." He described the fault, the cascade from a secondary bus into the primary navigation overlay, the corrupted display, the manual override, the reset sequence. He described it technically and accurately, and several of the pilots in the room who had done enough instrument flying to understand what he was describing shifted in their seats as the difficulty of it settled in. "What I watched from the tower that morning," he said, "was a pilot who encountered a compound systems failure, isolated the fault, implemented a manual solution using a reset protocol that is not in the standard checklist, stabilized the aircraft, and completed the mission. Without declaring emergency. Without breaking her flight profile." He paused. "In under 5 minutes." He let that sit for a moment. "I asked a question in the tower that morning that I want to return to now," he said. "I asked why this base's best pilot was not leading the unit." He looked at Hayes. "I received an answer about combat instinct and operational development. I have spent 30 years flying with some of the best aviators this country has ever produced. I know what combat instinct looks like. I have watched it in the air, and I have watched it in the recordings, and I have watched it in the way a pilot manages a crisis with 3 radio channels open and 2 separate emergencies developing simultaneously." The hangar was completely silent. Kincaid turned from Hayes and looked directly at Maya. "Captain Maya Brooks," he said, and his voice had the quality of someone stating a fact that has been verified beyond dispute, "is the best helicopter pilot I have ever seen." The silence held for 1 full second after the words landed. Then it broke, not in the way that forced applause breaks a silence, but in the way that something true breaks through when people finally stop working against it. Several pilots began applauding, and the sound spread through the room with the momentum of people who had been waiting for permission to believe something they had already suspected. Maya sat still for a moment. The applause was around her, and she let it be what it was without performing anything in response to it. She looked at the floor briefly, then looked up at Kincaid and gave him a single, direct nod, the acknowledgement of a professional receiving a professional judgment. Kincaid wasn't finished. He waited for the room to settle, and when it did, he moved to the matter that Paulson had briefed him on that morning, and he handled it with the same directness he had brought to everything else. He did not name Shaw in the room. That was not how these things were handled, and Kincaid was not a man who confused public humiliation with justice. He stated that an investigation had been opened into unauthorized access to a maintenance bay and deliberate tampering with flight-critical equipment, and that the investigation would be conducted through the appropriate channels, with full cooperation required from all unit personnel. He stated that the evidence had been preserved and was in the hands of the investigating authority. He stated that this matter was separate from the evaluation of a unit's aviation readiness, but that it reflected on the character of the unit's leadership environment, and that the command would be examining how that environment had been allowed to develop. He looked at Hayes when he said that last part. Hayes did not look away. To his credit, he didn't try to manage his expression. He just absorbed it. Shaw, in the second row, had gone very still. The people on either side of him had shifted almost imperceptibly in their seats, the small physical language of people creating distance. Cole sat 3 rows back with his hands on his knees, looking at the front of the room with an expression that was not satisfaction, but something more grounded than that. Relief, maybe. The feeling of having done something that needed doing and seeing it arrive at the right place. Ortega was standing along the sidewall with the other crew chiefs. He watched the proceedings with the settled calm of a man who had already done his part and was now simply watching the outcome take its shape. The briefing ended at 09:15, and the room began to disperse with the particular quality of movement that follows something significant. Quieter than usual, people talking in small groups. The atmosphere changed in a way that would take time to fully understand. Maya walked out through the side door and onto the tarmac. The morning air was cool and still, and the sky above the flight line was that clear, hard blue that only shows up when the previous day's smoke has been completely scoured away. The Apaches sat in their rows, rotors still, waiting for the day's work. She had always loved this part of the morning. The base not yet fully in motion, the aircraft patient on the tarmac, the sky open above everything. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was Kincaid. He had come through the same side door, and he walked toward her with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything. When he reached her, he stopped and looked at the flight line for a moment before he spoke. "You knew something was off about that aircraft before you flew the mission yesterday," he said. "Ortega's confirmation told you." She looked at him. "I suspected, and you flew it anyway." "There were people who needed the mission flown," she said, "and I knew what I was doing." Kincaid was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Apaches, then back at her. "I'm going to recommend a formal review of this unit's assignment practices and command climate in my evaluation report," he said. "That's the mechanism for addressing the systemic part of what's been happening here." She nodded. "What I can't do," he said, "is give back the year you flew well while people pretended not to notice." He looked at her directly. "But I can make sure the record from this point forward reflects what you actually are." Maya held his gaze. 30 years of military aviation looked back at her, not with pity, not with the particular weight of someone correcting an old wrong, but with the straightforward recognition of one professional seeing another clearly. "That's enough, sir," she said. Kincaid gave a single nod, the same kind she had given him in the hangar. Then he turned and walked back toward the operations building, and she turned back toward the flight line. The Apaches waited in their rows in the clean morning light. Beyond them, the runway stretched out long and open, and beyond the runway, the desert sky went all the way to the mountains, clear and blue and enormous, the way it gets on the best flying days. Maya looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to find Ortega, because there was an aircraft to inspect and a day of flying ahead, and the sky had always been hers. It had just taken the right person, finally, to say it out loud. If this story hit different, like and subscribe. We've got more coming that you won't want to miss.